Reminder, my book club, Submissive and Readable, has an Instagram now, link in the description. Please go give it a follow. We are trying very hard to beat Reese Witherspoon and get our own display at Chapters and Barnes & Noble.
Hey everyone, I hope you're doing well. I am not, because I just found out that there are like 7 Maze Runner books. So I've given you guys a taste of the stuff that I am currently reading. Well, I currently like to read now as an adult. But how about we take a look back a little bit at some of the things I used to read? Yes, today I want to go over a lot of the books that made up my childhood and early teenage years. I was basically reading as soon as I could, like as soon as I learned how to read. I was just going at it, and I went at it until I was about like 14 or 15 or so. Yes, once I got into high school, I pretty much exclusively only read manga for like 5 or 6 years. And you know, in the past 3 years or so, I've gotten back into reading novels, and now I read them more than manga. I still read manga. Still love me a good weekly chapter of Chainsaw Man. But yeah, I'm kind of back to the point with regular novels that I was as a kid, where I was just always reading them. And now my time with manga is well documented. But what happened before that? Let's get into it. Probably the first significant book series I had ever gotten into was... I can't avoid it. I can't avoid it. Harry Potter. I'm not going to be talking about this series very often on my channel. I am very against Joanne, and yeah, I'll just leave it there. But at the same time, it is kind of what got me into reading. God. Because my mom actually started reading these books to me when I was a very small child. I can't believe I wasn't even terrified of them. I was literally like 4 years old when my mom first read the series to me. And she read them all to me right up until when the series ended. I would eventually go and reread them all myself again. But yes, this was a very significant series for me. I don't know if they hold up as well. I still like the movies, but I don't know, like everything I hear about the books now as an adult, I'm just like, I don't think I would enjoy this if I went back, and I'm not gonna go back. Now, when I could finally read full-length chapter books on my own, and it was up to me to choose which ones I wanted to read, well, obviously, the most appealing thing on the shelf to like a 7 to 8-year-old boy was Captain Underpants. I can't even picture what my life would actually be like without Captain Underpants. It's of course a goofy story about 2 best friends who hypnotize their principal into being Captain Underpants, a comic book character that they created. And then a bunch of alien magic stuff happens, which causes the stories in their comics to sort of come to life. Every book was a fun adventure. They all had a pretty strict formula, but they were always super fun. And I could not get enough of them as a kid. In fact, inspired by these books, I used to draw my own comics back when I was like a little kid. I still have those somewhere. I don't like they're horrifically cringe nowadays. I don't know if I'll ever share them. But yeah, this led me to get interested in art and drawing, and it's something I still do. Of course, I still draw comics. I have one up on Webtoons right now. And I don't know if I would have discovered these passions without Captain Underpants. I am very envious, though, of the more modern Captain Underpants fans, like kids who are now getting into it. See, when I first caught up to the series, the 8th book had been brand new, and that was the last book for a while. Dave Pilkey, the author, he went on a long hiatus. I found out later that it was because he was caring for his sick mother, which was very commendable. But for an 8-year-old kid, I was very impatient, and so I inevitably grew out of the series without it ever seeing a proper conclusion. But man, the mid-2010s were the place to be for Captain Underpants fans. Not only did we get a movie from DreamWorks, which I did see, and I think it's actually like really good. Like, I was surprised how much the style of humor held up, as juvenile as it could be. But yeah, that was a really good movie. And we also got a cartoon show, which I would have killed for, I would have murdered for as a child. And of course, Dave Pilkey would come back, write the last few books, and finish up the series. And I never did go back. Those books are very kid-oriented. I don't think I would enjoy them much anymore. But yeah, I really do respect and appreciate this series. And if I'm ever responsible for picking out a book for a child, this will be one of my go-tos for sure. Now, as I got a bit older, I started seeking, a bit more challenging work, started moving into the middle grade demographic. Of course, where stakes were a bit higher, stories were a bit more serious, still kid-friendly, but just a bit more intense. And that's where Goosebumps comes in. I am a huge horror fan, and I'm pretty sure that stemmed from Goosebumps. I remember being a little kid and my dad reading me these books and me absolutely shitting myself. These were almost too scary to read when I was super young. As I got a little bit older, though, I mustered up the courage to read them myself, and I was absolutely addicted to these books. I never did read every single one, but I did read quite a good bit of them. You could go to used book fairs and bookstores at this point and just find dozens and dozens of Goosebumps books for very cheap, so I owned a lot of them. And I would marathon. I mean, they're very short books, like I could often take one out in a day or two, but they were so fun, so addicting. And while I don't think a lot of them hold up very well, some of them still do. And I think R.L. Stine was just very talented at what he did, because it is not easy to write actual scary horror for children. It's easy to scare a child, but it's got to be at that right level where, like, it's scary for them, but they also want to keep reading. And I thought he just did a fantastic job of that. The Headless Ghost was probably the scariest one for me as a kid. I don't remember much about it other than being absolutely terrified. And I followed the series, I believe at this point, the Goosebumps Horrorland series was like the new iteration of Goosebumps coming out, and I enjoyed those too. Those ones had like a bit of a overarching narrative, which I really enjoyed as a kid, getting into more series like that. Another series I got into was the 39 Clues. This was such a cool series to read as a kid. If you're unaware, the 39 Clues, it was about a brother and sister and like this massive extended family they had. When the matriarch of the family dies, like she reveals to everyone at the funeral that they're part of like this secret society and there are 39 clues that they can travel around the world to find. And it was just this crazy web of tangled conspiracies and mysteries. But this series was really unique and it did a lot of interesting things to engage the children audience more. Each hardcover edition of these books, and they were also sold separately, were cards. This was attached to a card game, but not like a traditional trading card game like Pokemon or something. What you would do is you would then take the codes on these cards, head onto their website where you could create an account, and collect clues yourself. Some of the clues were, attached to the cards. With each book you got, you were, like, guaranteed to get a clue. But they were also just, cool, fun collectibles. They look really dumb, looking back on them. But, yeah, it was so cool. And you could go online, you could play all these sorts of games. You could see, how many clues you had, how many clues other people had. What was fun is that you were, like, actually finding clues that they would find in the books before they actually found them in the books. Because that was the other thing. These books came out frequently. Like, every few months there was a new one, which, as a kid following it, was really, really great. I was able to complete, like, basically the original first 10 books in the series before I grew out of it, which was great, because that unfortunately happens a lot when you're a kid. Another interesting thing is that they would rotate authors with this one. In fact, like, pretty much every book had a different author. Some would return, some were collaborations. Just a really cool idea, a cool collaboration, and another series I respect a lot. I know it went on for like ages afterwards. I don't know how it holds up, whatever. I enjoyed my time with it when I was a kid. Something notable though, the first book in the series was Rick Riordan. And this was my introduction to Rick Riordan. Now, I have talked at length already on this channel just last month about Percy Jackson, so I'm not really going to be discussing it here. Check out that video if you want to learn more about my experience. But I absolutely loved it, and out of all these books I'm talking about here, it was probably my favorite as a kid, and it still holds up incredibly well. A series of unfortunate events. Of course, the story of the Baudelaire orphans, who are taken in by an evil relative who's trying to snatch their fortune away from them, and they send him on quite a wild goose chase. This was near the end, I think, of my middle grade era when I read these books, because they were a bit more mature. They did deal with, a lot of death and dark things happening, but they were very clever books, and they had a lot of humor and sarcasm to them. The way Lemony Snicket narrated the story was super unique for me at the time. He added a lot of insight to it. There was a lot of educational value too. Even though I was at an age where, I could understand these books fine. He would always go into these long-winded metaphors explaining certain concepts, and it was always very entertaining. And the plot got absolutely wild in these books. Learning that Lemony Snicket wasn't actually the author, like in real life, and he was a character in the universe writing these books, That blew my mind. And these books were so quick and accessible too. I really, really enjoyed this one. And again, I'm a bit envious that kids these days are growing up with a much better adaptation than the one we had. I think the original film is okay. Jim Carrey was perfectly cast. But the one with Neil Patrick Harris on Netflix, it's probably the most faithful adaptation that anything here has ever gotten. And it's absolutely great, and it still holds up remarkably well. Like, if you grew up with these books series, you should really watch the show, because it is great. The Shadow Children was an interesting series. I'm interested to see how many people actually know about this one, because while I think it was popular, I don't really see anyone ever mention it. This was sort of my first taste of young adult dystopia, which will be a common theme throughout the rest of this video. But it takes place in this totalitarian version of America where, similar to how it was in China, there was a 2 baby per family limit to counter overpopulation and starvation. People said, all right guys, if you have a 3rd baby, we're gonna kill them. I feel like if the government has so much power in this world, just like mandate vasectomies, like after they have the 2nd kid, just like immediately do the snip snip. That would solve all your problems. It's a kid's book, whatever. The story followed Luke, one of these 3rd children, who of course could not be seen in public, so his family sort of just keep him locked up in the attic. I mean, they still love him and care for him, but this is just the world they live in. And then he learns that, the family next door actually has a 3rd child as well, and he meets her, and they realize, oh, there's this whole rebellion of 3rd children, and it just took you on this really crazy journey of all of these different 3rd children from all different walks of life, sort of coming together and revolting. I feel like this does not hold up very well because it sounds a bit dumb as I'm explaining it. Not really the premise, but just like, I'm trying to remember like the events of how everything happened, and I'm like, really? All these kids did this? What? But anyway, this was a series I did really enjoy. We had actually, I believe in the 7th grade, we actually, learned, we did the first book as part of the curriculum. What I liked about this series was it actually, the POV jumped around quite a bit. I think there's 7 books. While most of them follow the main character, there were 3 or 4 that would just follow a different character, and I thought that was really interesting. There's a joke to be made about this one, but I will not say it. Oh, I was so cool. I was so cool when I was 12 years old at the grade 7 book fair, and I got the 13+ rated Hunger Games book. I was an adult baby. The time had come. Yes, the Hunger Games, to no one's shock, was a very significant series, especially for me, the time I was in junior high, the time everyone was just coming of age to read these books. The trilogy had just concluded with Mockingjay, and the movie was in the works and would come out shortly after. And yeah, this book went extremely hard, and I have no shame in saying it. I absolutely loved The Hunger Games as a kid. The world, while it doesn't really make sense in retrospect, it was so engaging, and I loved the characters, and I thought it was super suspenseful. Just The Hunger Games it's just really a great setup, and this, of course, kicked off a huge boom in dystopian sci-fi teen novels. They had existed before, but not quite like this. Yes, it seemed specifically designed to appeal to teenagers of all sorts. It had the violent action for all the boys, it had the romance for all the girls. I know the generalizations and all, but that's what it was like. We actually even, I believe in the 8th grade, we studied this as part of our curriculum and did a bunch of activities. I remember we literally did a mock Hunger Games, out in the soccer field. That seems a bit problematic in retrospect, but I'm gonna ignore that. I have no desire to read it again. I'd rather just, keep my memory of Hunger Games and Catching Fire being absolute bangers. But then something happened. I read Mockingjay. Now, up to this point, I felt positive about every book I had read, in my entire life, almost. I was a very optimistic kid, and whenever I read a book that didn't quite click with me, I would still just be like, okay, that was good, not for me, moving on. There were never any books I would say I straight up disliked. Until Mockingjay. Mockingjay was rough. And to this day, I'm still like, man, what did they do? What did they do here? And I remember being scared to tell people because these books were so popular and everyone loved them. I'm like, I don't want to be shunned for not liking Mockingjay. So I just kept my mouth shut. And then eventually when we got to the Mockingjay movies, a lot of people realized Mockingjay was not good. So I was cool then. But man, what a rough end to a series that at this point I had really been a fan of. So in my disappointment, I ended up searching for things that were similar similar to The Hunger Games. The City of Ember was a series about a town living underground after the apocalypse had happened above. Hundreds of years have passed, and they're running out of food and resources in the underground, so our main characters have to try to figure out a way to save the town and maybe escape to the surface. This was a book I really liked as a kid. I also really liked the movie. Movie doesn't really hold up. I don't know about the book. But I ended up not really vibing with the second book, and once we got to the third book, like, this was another one that I really, really hated. I thought this was even worse than Mockingjay at the time. So I went back to the drawing board, and I discovered The Maze Runner. Oh, yes. Oh, The Maze Runner. And like Hunger Games, I loved it. I absolutely loved this book, and I have no shame in it. I remember doing a whole ass book report on it once. All of these kids waking up with no memory inside this giant maze full of monsters that wanted to kill them, and clues and mysteries, and it was sick. It was really, really cool. It had all that violence that my hormonal brain was craving, and this really cool story to keep me engaged. But then they left the maze, and they discover what's actually going on. There's like a plague. Like, knowing what was going on was a lot less interesting than being in the dark. But despite that, I do remember liking the second book a good bit as well. But then, again, the third book came around, and I absolutely loathed it. What was going on? Why were all of these dropping the ball at the third book? I was becoming very disenchanted with YA dystopia. Like, all of these series started off so good, and then something happened. I don't know. To this day, I'm like, guys, just plan out your trilogy. What do you plan it out, man? I was about ready to give up. Because, like, all roads seem to be leading to disappointment. But right at the start of high school, there was one final YA book I read. This is one that was becoming very popular. A lot of my friends were reading it. A lot of my friends were recommending it to me. So I bought the bullet and bought Divergent. I made it about 100 pages in this one, and that was enough for me, man. This was so unfathomably uninteresting to me. I could not believe it. Now, this series has been reanalyzed in recent years by a lot of people who used to love it, and most people seem to agree that it was pretty bad. But right from the beginning, man, this was the nail in the coffin of my YA reading days. It was like Hunger Games without the games, which was like the good part of Hunger Games. And I feel like Divergent was sort of the start of the downfall of the YA dystopia trend. Obviously, it still exists in some ways, but like this massive explosion we saw with the Hunger Games and the Maze Runner, that type of stuff. Once the Divergent movies happened, I think people were pretty much done with the genre. They didn't even finish those movies. They just stopped. Now, could I have saved my love for reading novels? Yes. I think it's very clear in retrospect that what I should have done at this point was move to more adult fantasy books. I was around the age where a lot of people jumped to those, but I sort of missed it because, all of my peers were still reading YA stuff. I didn't really know what else was out there. So yeah, I don't regret my years reading manga at all. A lot of the series I still absolutely love to this day, but I do kind of wish I had kept reading. Just a little bit. However, there is one exception to all of this. Okay, in grade 11, probably the coolest thing we ever did in school was read The Hobbit. Now, I was a fan of the Lord of the Rings films at this point. I even liked the Hobbit movies that were coming out at the time. I don't really anymore, but I would say I was a pretty big fan of the Peter Jackson universe, and The Hobbit absolutely blew me away. I adored this book when I read it. I'm sure a lot of people can relate in that I procrastinated reading this book until literally the last minute. Then I had a weekend to read it, and I was dreading it. But I flew through that book, and I loved every single second of it. So much so that despite my commitment to manga, I ended up reading the entire Lord of the Rings trilogy. Now, it did take me a long time. Manga had really messed up my attention span. But I did get through the original series, and it was something else, man. Can't really say much about Lord of the Rings that hasn't already been said, but Yeah, this was it. This was it. And they were the last novels I would read for a very long time. And honestly, at least I read those. I'm going through them again, of course, with the audiobooks, and I like them even more now. They're seriously some of the best books ever written, in my opinion. And I'm very glad that they capped off my childhood. So that will do it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. You can leave your thoughts on any of these series in the comments down below, and let me know some of the books that you grew up with. I mean, there's a whole bunch that were popular that I didn't read, a whole bunch that I did read that I didn't have time to mention.
It occurred to me while editing that I somehow forgot to mention Diary of a Wimpy Kid. So for that reason, I am hereby confirming that at some point in the future, this will be getting a part 2.
Did anyone out there read The Day My Butt Went Psycho? Please tell me I'm not alone. Oh my god. There was a whole trilogy. I read the whole thing. Someone out there, please.